Namaskara, good evening, and welcome to this evening's BIC Streams session 259 hashtag keywords for India, colloquial and scholarly. This BIC Streams session is based on the book Keywords for India, a conceptual lexicon for the 21st century, edited by Rukmini Bhaya Nayar and Peter Ronald deSouza. What terms are currently up for debate in Indian society? How have the meanings changed over time? This book highlights keywords for modern India in everyday usage as well as in scholarly contexts. Encompassing over 250 keywords across a wide range of topics, including aesthetics and ceremony, gender, technology and economics, past memories, and future imaginaries. These entries introduce some of the basic concepts that inform the cultural unconscious of the Indian subcontinent in order to translate them into critical tools for literary, political, cultural, and cognitive studies. On the panel with us this evening are the editors Rukmini Nayar and Peter Roland deSouza, along with Shiv Vishwanathan, Vrinda Dalmia, with Chandan Gowda interlocuting the discussion. Bios of all the speakers will appear on the chat box, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And through the conversation, if anybody in the audience would like to make a comment, ask a question, or share an observation, please feel free to use the Q&A box next to the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And with that, over to Chandan.
Thank you, Lekha. Thank you to BIC for hosting this discussion on this very exciting book, Keywords for India. I think the "for" is an important word there. Those of you who may not have been in social science ever should know that there are a few questions that keep getting raised, very big questions. Is there an Indian self? Is there an Indian sense of politics? Is there a theory of caste? Is a theory of the Indian state, etc.? And these questions have been raised for a long time, and they continue to wait for someone to engage them properly. But in the meantime, what this book has done is to not wait for such a colossal sort of task to achieve fruition, but launch a series of what could be seen as mutinies at the level of concepts, objects, institutions, personality types. If you simply look through the table of contents, which you will be able to do so if you look for this book on any online retailer site, you will see what I mean. You have Atma, Kismat, and Shakti. You have Bollywood and Mandi. You have Chappal and Godrej Almera. You have gym, malls, beauty parlors, missed call, selfie, startup. So, and then character types like Ambedkarite, Nehruvian, Matlabi, Coolie, Cycle Wala. These are things, which all of us use in a fairly unself-conscious, theoretically unself-conscious ways. But if this book will tell you that they're actually very layered and very complex and deserving of very serious and creative intellectual attention, and even non-intellectual attention, if you will. So the interest at describing ourselves better. Peter deSouza, one of the editors of the book, in his epilogue says we need terms of representation that are asli, that are genuine, and Rukmini's introduction tells us about the need to be extremely sensitive to the concept diversity in the language diversity that we inhabit. And this book, the blurb would say, as well as Rukmini's introduction, owes some of its inspiration to Raymond Williams, the British sociologist of literature's famous book called Keywords. But there are essential differences. Any quick glance will let you know that. That book, at the end of the day, is a scholastic exercise urging scholars to be very careful about etymology and how word shifts have happened in time. So in a way, it is trying to codify a field of discussion, trying to nudge for theory building of a certain careful kind. And this book has something larger at stake. intellectual autonomy, intellectual freedom, and creativity itself. And Peter actually reminds us of the K.C. Bhattacharya, the philosopher's famous essay, what is Swaraj, intellectual Swaraj in ideas. So the book is broadly, trying to pull us, invite us in that direction, and it does so in a variety of ways. This book is not only for the academic. Anyone can pick it up and embark upon a journey of sorts into their own self. The language is not of a specialist kind that draws boundaries between the academic specialist and the non-academic reader. And you can quarrel with the book and see what other words you would have liked to have seen in this book, etc., etc. It's really a very friendly book in that sense. It is not trying to be high-handed in how it is making its offer. So it's delightful that way. A quick note about the format of the discussion to follow. The editors of the book will introduce the book in their own, individually. And then we have Vrunda Dalmia and Shiv Viswanathan responding to the book. And then the editors will get to respond to their responses. And this entire Jugalbandi will go on for 45 minutes and no more. And after which the audience will be free to ask their questions, and we'll take it from there. Thank you again, everyone being on this panel. Vrunda, especially, it's 3 a.m. where she is, and it's very nice of her to have not let that come in the way of being on this panel. Thank you all.
So let me begin by thanking you in particular, and the Bengal and the Bangalore. I said Bengal, you notice? That's kind of word slip, which is quite important, and I'm going to bring it up in a second, with the Bangalore International Center for arranging this event. As you know, we are very excited about this book. And let me also begin by wishing everybody happy Vaisakhi. Vaisakhi is, we are going through this COVID crisis, and so many really awful things are happening economically, medically, in terms of migrancy and so on. But this past week, the 13th onwards, all the way up to the 15th yesterday, is celebrated in many parts of the country as the festival of Vaisakhi, or in Bengal, Poila Boishakh. Now, Poila Boishakh is not a word in the book, but it could have been there if we hadn't taken out our section on national holidays and festivities, because it became too long. Let me just use this non-word, a word that doesn't come into it is not a non-word, but it does not come into our lexicon as an emblem of the sorts of issues that we are concerned with, and as an inductive emblem. And so if you look at the history of this word in Bengal, it has a history which connects with the Mughals, because it is said that the Emperor Akbar introduced this year, or took up this year as the first year of the month, when the account books, the Hal Khata in Bengal, was opened. And it is even associated with a kind of weather, a storm, which we had in Delhi, Kal Boishakhi. So overall, in terms of region, in terms of religion, in terms of borders and boundaries between economically privileged group of people and the peasants, this word represents a kind of cultural history which belongs to a particular region, but could potentially belong to all of India. So that notion is important, that collectivities and ways of thinking and conceptualizations have a history. They are encapsulated memory. And this word, when I greet you saying Happy Poila Boishakh or Happy Vaishakhi, I'm drawing on this thread of narrative, which is regional and cultural, but also culture specific, but also has resonance, perhaps, in a lot of regions of India and not in others. So with that, let me go on to say, to point out some of the things about our book and its conceptualization, just as an initiation of the aspects of the book of which I hope there will be some discussion today. Now, the first aspect is that to do with temporality and narrative. Words, to my mind, are the keepers of time. And what you can see, as we saw in the Vaishakhi example, is that they contain a whole memory and a whole history, and sometimes those memories and histories resonate across the region, and not only are they words for India, but they are global. For example, this word Poila Boishakh is today part of a UNESCO cultural heritage. It's part of the World Cultural Heritage in Dhaka University. So words keep on changing and moving. So in some ways, we should look at temporality of these words and a shared history, which is also a contentious history. So that's one aspect. Some people say cherchez la femme in the detective novel. Some people say follow the money. I say follow the words, and they will open up everything for you. So that's one aspect, the temporality aspect. Then there is the spatial aspects, because words are not only the keepers of time, they are the keepers of space. Not only space on the page, I remember how many discussions we had with our 200 contributors who made up this magnificent collectivity about the length of their pieces, how much space they would occupy. So its spatial relationships were very important, because we had to get this huge flow, the stream of words, into some kind of architectural structure. And we have discussed that structure in terms of databases of memory, in terms of political imaginaries, and as the person introducing it said, all the way up to political histories. So that's another aspect, the spatial architecture of these words and how they connect to each other in terms of conceptual histories and conceptual alliances across the country. Now, the third thing that I wanted to talk about is very important for me. And so the one theme is temporality, the next theme is spatial architecture. The third theme is, to my mind, very important, which is emotional. The emotional energy which these words have for so many of us, their affective resonance. And so part of the impetus for this is that we wanted to produce not a Raymond Williams copy, but something different. And so when the publishers asked me what kind of book we would like to produce, I said it must mainly be written by Indians who have the affective and experiential energy to contribute to this volume, and that has not been done before. The second is that we introduced material culture terms for the first time in any keyword lexicon, like balti, lota, and all the rest of it, and many missing ones. So that was our inductive base for theorization. Then we introduced a very important aspect of modernity, which is acronyms. And most important of all, we paid attention to the continuities between the oral and the written. So for example, this is the first keywords dictionary of India, which has a syllabic transcription for words. Of course, one must quarrel with these because these things are contentious. So that's the third aspect that I would like to talk about. And finally, let me just mention two things. One is when we look at the cover of this book, we find this enigmatic woman. I talked about Cherchez la Femme, and here is this woman from the 12th century, this image which we can associate with India. But who is she? How does she speak to us? What she's absorbed in the act of writing. What does that act of writing, that act of reading, that act of being? You know, a baby is tugging at her. Is it her child? Is it her own? She's holding up, she's a pilaster. So she's holding up the whole conceptual architecture of that space. So I would say that there are many mysteries, many quarrels, many dissensions, but also continuities in this volume. And we need to tease them out when we talk about what this volume may mean and the questions it raises. I'll stop there for now and allow Peter to do a more comprehensive or a different kind of, bring a different entry point into this discussion. Thanks.
Okay, I too would like to begin by thanking the Bangalore International Center for being kind enough to organize this, and to Chandan for initiating the whole exercise. I'll talk about the book from a slightly different angle than the one that Rukmini has spoken about, because in some sense, in producing this book, we complemented each other in terms of bringing our different interests and capabilities together. If hers was more philosophical and very much within language, mine is more political. Not that hers is not political, but mine was more political because that's where I am essentially located. Now, I say this because while the Raymond Williams book, in a sense, provided the basis for our exercise, there were three other motivations. The first was that this established its difference from the Raymond Williams thing. This is a multi-author production. You know, it's 200 authors have contributed nearly 250 entries, and that's a huge exercise. To even be able to see it to fruition was a miracle of sorts. 200 authors from across the country having to be followed and chased and persuaded to send in their entries. Now, 200 entries does not make a comprehensive collection, and everyone from any section of India is certainly going to protest that it's not representative. Some parts are overrepresentative, some parts are underrepresentative. So we realized that at the very start, this is not a comprehensive or a representative book. It's a beginning. And the purpose of the beginning, which brings us to the second point, is to prepare a lexicon for India. As Chandan very rightly said, Rukmini and I debated, should it be off, should it be for, should it be from? And I think when we said for India, in a sense, we were signaling a very clear political intention. You see, quite often, and this is where our dissatisfaction comes in, a lot of the vocabulary of humanities and social sciences is a vocabulary very strongly rooted in a European linguistic sphere: English, German, French, Latin, perhaps. And therefore, we have to draw on these concepts or derive or adopt a derivative idiom to represent the reality of India, a reality which is so layered, which has cultural nuances, which has political innovations, which has a whole, like for example, we have the word gherao, and through that word gherao, we've listed a set of political practices from Rasta Roko to gherao to fast, etc., to describe distinctive political activities in India. So we were unhappy with the vocabulary that today we use and are forced to use to describe India, to represent India, to represent the politics of India, to represent social reality in India. And I say this because this places people who are not from the metropolis, the linguistic metropolis, at a disadvantage. People coming from regions outside the linguistic metropolis want to tell their story, and they don't have the vocabulary because they have a vocabulary which is rooted in the bhasas. I mean, I have been having this conversation with Chandan that if you read Bhairappa in Kannada and you read Bhairappa in English, are you reading two different texts? Because what is available in Kannada may not be you won't be able to say the same things in English, even though Bhairappa's Parva is very ably translated by Raghavendra Rao. So we began to realize that there is a whole world of experience that needs to be represented in the humanities and social sciences world, and that's our final motivation to, in a sense, combat the asymmetries of knowledge between the global north and the global south. That's certainly the motivation that I brought to the table, because I believe that very often we begin to recreate words and recreate realities which come from derived frameworks. And if we had our own vocabulary, maybe we would be able to tell the story differently. Now, of course, the northern episteme is so powerful. It dominates everything. There is very little in the social sciences and humanities which does not have to rely on this linguistic sphere. So we've definitely taken language as our point of entry, as the area in which we were going to mount our challenge. And we did this in 4 ways. We looked for words across the linguistic diversity of India. And we looked for words which would do 4 things. The first thing they would do is infiltrate the language of humanities and social sciences. So to infiltrate. And we did that by choosing words which have already a high recognition in our own philosophical traditions, like Swaraj or Rasa or Leela or Satyagraha or Izzat. So we chose words which already have a certain presence in philosophical discourses in the non-English speaking world. So infiltrate. The second is to elevate, to take words which are very much part of everyday speech and give them the ambition to become concepts. So to elevate them to conceptual status. For example, words like mela, words like time pass, words like janjat, words even that have become a part of our everyday speech. UPSC, it's an acronym, but it's an acronym which has become a word and which means a lot to people in India. He's doing the UPSC. He's done the UPSC. He's UPSC passed. Or take VIP. Similarly, VIP has a certain meaning, which somebody in India, it says a lot when you talk of somebody as a VIP or a VVIP. The third exercise was to appropriate, to take English words or German words or Portuguese words. We've got sossegado in the lexicon, and to make them Indian, to infuse them with Indian meanings. So file, Shiv has done an excellent entry on file. Or setting. Setting is a very English word, but the way it's used in India, I think no English person would be able to understand it. Or tension. Tension finds presence in every language area in India, from Bengali to Kerala. And finally, the fourth motivation is to populate, to take words from within the Indian languages sphere, and to bring them into social science and humanities discourse, so that humanities and social sciences discourse gets compelled to use them if they want to represent India. So karma, for example, has already made an entry. Dharma has already made an entry. Guru has already made an entry. Pandit has already made an entry. But maybe we can populate it with many, many more words. So this was our motivation, to, in a sense, breach the conceptual fortress of the global north by using language as our point of entry. Thank you.
you, Peter. Rukmini. Vrinda?
Okay, so let me first try and establish an affective connection between two ends of the globe by wishing you all Shubho Navabarsho. And I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to be on this panel. I want to make 2 points, and I will play with the notion of key and take the word key itself very seriously in my comments. But I begin by stepping inside the vast world of one of the keywords actually presented to us in the volume, the proper name Mahabharat. Yudhisthira once asked Bhishma the simple question, what is truth or satya? Instead of giving a definition stating the necessary and sufficient conditions of truth, Bhishma replied by listing 13 other words. Words like self-control, non-envy, forgiveness, and shame. Now, none of these seem even close to what we ordinarily mean by truth. Bhishma was clearly not in the business of giving synonyms. Does he then provide Yudhisthira with something like key words to unlock the mystery of truth? But note that the words listed refer to moral virtues, dispositions to act and to do in certain ways. They are ways to or practices of truth, satya acharas. And Yudhishthira's interest in the nature of truth or satya akara takes him to the praxis of self-making. However, doings figure in the Keywords project in a different way. We say things with words, but we also do things with them, of course, a la J.L. Austin. But when some words are conceived as keys, they clearly must be turned to enter into the soul of culture. And someone or a we must do the turning. In emphasizing that they are not giving us a dictionary, but a lexicon or a vocabulary, the editors make evident that meanings of keywords do not directly represent culture in the same way as the word dog refers to the four-legged animal. So I want to explore how the keywords function here. What are the doings in the words in the keywords project? This we shall see brings in tow doers with important political consequences. So the keyword approach to culture, Indian culture, or if you will, the proper name India itself, begins by intuitively separating being in the world into 7 aspects. Collating an eccentric stock of words to represent these domains create a picture of a lived quotidian space. The words in this space are, to use Rukmini's very evocative metaphor, like peacocks with long tails. Dharma, for instance, she says, originates in high theory, but filters down to the political everyday. I am reminded also of the humble word jhadu, becoming a jhadu devata and morphing into a marker for urban subaltern identity, which then bleeds into political mobilization for environmental purposes. So as connectors between distinct domains, keywords imply that their associated concepts also subtly shift as the words travel. A subterranean conceptual map of crisscrossing relations is held together only by the linguistic identity of a word type. The culture of contemporary India is thus refracted prism-like by following the different trails or tales of various words. Such a tangle of words working together, and this is important for me, the words work together shows what culture is without any of them naming what it is. I hazard the hypothesis then that keywords perform culture in different ways. But then I wonder if, and this is my question, if most words are keys, are most words keys then? Is designating a keyword arbitrary, or does it depend on the location of the chooser? Now note that this is a different question than the open-endedness of the list of keywords which the editors have addressed. So moving on to my second point, if the actual, now remember the word actual has the word act in it. If actual keywords enact a dynamic culture, the keyword methodology is, as Peter says, again, an act of liberation. The distinction between keywords for and from India becomes important here, as Chandan pointed out in his introduction. The editors consciously create a word space for India that models hierarchies between elite words and the linguistically subaltern. And this is the point made by Peter in his introduction. Similarly, keywords from India cross international borders to infiltrate a conceptual space of other languages. For instance, when words like guru, karma, kismat are added to world languages, their serendipitous entanglements with the English vocabulary could slacken, maybe, the grip of individualistic conceptions of autonomy and power in the Anglo world. So now these are very clear-cut subversive acts performed by keywords. However, the ongoing dialectic between keywords for and from India harkens to more complicated power struggles. To illustrate, as Sanskrit heritage terms, darshana and moksha, two words in the volume, are words for India that capture reflective inquiry in the subcontinent. But when juxtaposed with other English words like philosophy, argument, instrumental reason, and pure reason, darshana and moksha are evacuated of their rational import. This infiltration of indigenous words into English then becomes toothless by getting appropriated by the master language and not being able to appropriate English themselves. And this, of course, refers to the story of how in English, reasoning is associated with a step-by-step argumentative process, whereas darshana is intuitive, mystical insight. So because of this, when philosophers in the Anglo-American world used darshana as a keyword for India to understand India, it had the politically convenient but ironic consequence that words for Indian philosophy signified actually the absence of philosophy in India. Of course, post-colonial Indians pushed back. Darshana and moksha were reframed with other terms like anvikshiki, tarka, yukti, alongside words from medical and aesthetic practice. Such a populating, which is one of the political strategies in the book, such populating of the indigenous vocabulary for India enabled a concept of rationality, even without a specific Indian word for it, and helped reclaim the argumentative India from her colonial erasure. Thus, and I'm concluding, the liberatory or decolonial possibilities in the diachronic dance of, say, darshana as both for and from India depends on whether Indian words that infiltrate the global stage are elevated or get appropriated. And this is uncertain, determined partly by the historical context and the users of the words. However, even the possibility of such subversive encounters with the future, I think it's a beautiful phrase, encounters with the future. So even this possibility of a subversive encounter with the future make the keywords method important. Simply interpreting culture with the turn of a key can well become the project of changing it. But then, to return to what I began with, the political fidelity of the speakers or users of words, determining the choices and the deeds that these words are allowed to perform, become important. And of course, fidelity of choice goes back to the virtues of truth seekers suggested in the Mahabharat. So thank you. That's what I have.
Thanks a lot, Vrunda. Yeah, let me just add to Vrinda's, extremely important point about, any concept, even like the word tension that Peter mentioned. How do you listen to it from in terms of experience? What does one mean when someone says tension from different locations? The quality of listening and parsing through the layered connotations of that word, which is essentially the task of good ethnography. Can that be ensured in the case of the terms being used here? I suppose at least the living vocabulary, I would imagine, Vrunda, as opposed to making them flat, meaning-like terms to be used fairly comfortably, where its phenomenological registers are muted, I suppose, is a fear. But I wonder, Peter and Rukmini, if that's a risk that you felt needed to be taken and you just kind of plunged into this exercise, or was the sort of threat of appropriation something that you thought about while you chose the words, and how you asked your contributors to engage them in their entries? And that's a question I would have following on Vrinda's responses.
So I wanted to briefly respond before Peter came in, not necessarily take my whole 10 minutes, but maybe we can divide it up a little bit more into 5 minutes each. I think Vrinda made fairly important, I would say not only were they important, they were familiar because we debated these questions again and again. I'm going to respond to the question which both she and Chandan raised. Chandan rather more indirectly and Brinda directly. And the first objection was, or the first idea, which everyone has asked us and which of course occurred to us, was this idea of what is not a keyword. Okay, so as a linguist, I can answer that question, and the question of arbitrariness. Which keys do you pick? What is the size of the lock? And I wish I wish you were here, because in Bengali, we have a joke, which is ki holo, means what happened. And it is to describe a Bengali voyeur who looks through a keyhole. So that voyeur is somebody who's looking through a keyhole and seeing things voyeuristically. So the question word keyholo becomes the voyeuristic word where you look through a keyhole. You don't necessarily unlock a door, Sometimes you just look through a keyhole. But more seriously, in response to the question about arbitrariness, I would say that to a certain extent, this is inevitable. But I would say that one criteria that I used anyway, was the connection between the words. You mentioned the word act in the word actually. I will draw your attention to the word recognition, containing the word cognition, which is important. Recognition is to recognize something and to immediately see it. It is a type of darshana. So one of the criteria, the intuitive and affective criteria which occurred to me was, would people across the continent, and that is why I was keen on having lots of Indian contributors, recognize the word, a particular word like tension or darshan, and in different contexts, they might have their own interpretation or cognitive architecture for it, but they would recognize it. So the connection in my mind between recognition as a tool to understand cognition and how words connect to each other was very important. And recognition is a common word. Cognition is one of these scholarly words. They come together in understanding why we intuitively pick one word and not another. Why do we not say, let's say that the word but is a key word, or the word and is a key word? Why do we focus on nouns and or verbs? These are important questions which I can answer in more depth as a linguist, but just to make that connection between words that were widely and readily recognized by Indians across the subcontinent, with a few exceptions, that was one criteria. Then the other was to broaden it out so that regional words were included, like Sogadu or Susegad to some extent, and these were only signposts. These were pointers because of it's already a 500-word volume, so editing it was important. And that's why I don't want to harp on the question of arbitrariness. There is an element of arbitrariness, but more importantly, there's an element of cognition and recognition. In response to the point about the meaning of a word. What is the meaning? What is the affective meaning? What is the dhamma behind this word? Of course, a word is not the object you point to, which linguists call connotative meaning. So a dog means a dog, or a lion means a lion. But when you call somebody let's say a lion, or Vrinda is a flower, you don't mean she has petals, stamens, and or all these features of the denotative object flower. It actually means that she has the qualities, the connotative meaning of a flower. And we were reaching out to those connotative, affective, experiential meanings that attach to words. It means something to them in the linguistic landscape. So in response to the question of whether, you focus on denotative or connotative meaning, most of the words in this, because it's a conceptual lexicon, don't emphasize so much denotation as connotation. The sort of the resonance of a word, the rasa of a word, if you like. And that's why we have words like rasa. Now, everybody has their own interpretation. In Bengali, the word maya doesn't mean illusion necessarily. In the commonplace vocabulary, it means you feeling for somebody. Maya porlo. So these are the relationships which one expected the contributors, which they did nobly, to tease out. And I would also argue that in this choice, there is a politics, which brings me to the point which Peter will take up, but I must respond to, because you talked about these strategies of infiltration and elevation and so on, which we are very familiar with in post-colonial theory for many years, being also strategies of appropriation. So, and Peter actually has appropriation as a subcategory, but I was therefore resistant to actually adopting that vocabulary. But Peter adopted it as a political scientist, which to my mind gave an entirely different sort of theoretical meaning to these terms from the way that I have rejected them in many ways in post-colonial theory. So that is a difference. And there is no keywords volume to my mind which is worth anything without these kinds of conceptual quarrels, which we have and which will continue as we seek to build a sturdy politics of equality and access as much as infiltration. And even if we forget the global south or the global north, if we think of our country, which is the size of Western Europe and so complicated, how do we allow access, equity? How do we understand access, equity, etc., not allow, through words? So this was an important political consideration for me. With response to Peter and this volume, let's say this volume would not have taken off without him. It was just an idea which I was playing with. But to my mind, one of the most important thoughts which we have when we talk about Swaraj of ideas, and to me, one of the most important revolutions to come is when Dalits, when Adivasis, when women actually are able to infiltrate, if you like, but insert their own theory, their own words, but not only their own words, their own theories of text and orality into this space. And we haven't got there. But I think that these are the important futures to come for us, where we have those spaces populated, to use Peter's words. So the most important debate: how do you insert your vocabulary, not only your word, but your theory of text, your theory of concepts into the world, into this space of concept, this sort of argument, conceptual argument, is to my mind a step still to be taken. Finally, so I think you're right, Binda, when you say keywords is a methodology. But it is a methodology which is about, it is still to be explored. And Raymond Williams was important. He was a Marxist critic. He was asking about how words had changed after the war, so that people were using them in an entirely different fashion. But we are doing an exercise which may borrow a word from Raymond Williams, but not necessarily his perspective. And this comes out when he looked at only high culture words. We are looking at Balti, Lota, and so on. And that has come up through our engagement with our cultural space. Finally, with the Yudhisthira point, which I appreciated, and relate to the Austinian point you made about acting well, what Rousseau calls well-doing versus well-being, in answer to the question, what is truth? We know that, this idea of a word being an act, or at least a participant or a performative in an act, is an Austinian notion, but it is not unfamiliar within Indian or any other cultural tradition, where you have demonstration effects and experimental effects in words. So, for example, take the Yudhisthira story and Bhishma suggesting this moral vocabulary to him, which were keys into understanding the concept of Satya. as you interpret it very, very interestingly. Yudhisthira is the truth teller in the Mahabharat, and when he is, we all know the story of Ashwatthama Hatha, and he lowers his voice and says Iti Gaja, because Ashwatthama is the general's son, and when Ashwatthama dies, there would be a lot of consternation, but Ashwatthama, the elephant, is dead, and so what is he doing? He's doing a linguistic performative act. He's telling the truth and not strategically not telling the truth by lowering his voice. So in other words, you would understand truth as we understand these words in terms of political strategy. After all, when Yudhisthira tells his lie in the battlefield, in the heat of battle, he is in a politically fraught situation, and he manipulates language and still adheres to the notion of truth. So in many ways, we are looking at linguistic strategies, which we all have, where words are a form of action, and yet these kind of apply differently in different contexts of use. So I would come back to this notion of context, to these notions of recognition and cognition, of connotative and denotative meaning. And these are part of the architecture of the book, which we may critique. It's there for critique. But we did try to think about it, and I'm glad that you ask these questions, because they invite us not only to recognize, but to rethink. And that's the purpose of a book like this. It's shared meanings, and then it is contentious meanings coming together. So Vrinda, that's my answer. And now Peter will give you a politically, convincing answer.
Chandan, is Shiv joining us? So
we'll have to ask Raghu. He's been in touch with him. Were you able to establish contact, Raghu? I see him here, but I don't hear him.
should I just speak for a few minutes till we get Shiv on?
Yes. Peter, okay. I thought I should say something very quickly. In addition to this exercise, which is more than etymological and more than conceptual even, I just felt there was a very fascinating way in which you are nudging us to look at things in different ways. Almost as if you're nudging ethnographers to do, shouldn't you be looking at this in this way? And if you see the entry on Godrej Almera, there's a description of how the Almera comes to be used in a joint family and in a nuclear family, and how it was used when it came. And you can go on and on. And the character types, it just took me straight back to the 1920s, the Chicago School of Urban Sociologists, who had books called The Taxi, the prostitute, or the urban types that they felt were unique to the US cities. And I found, Ambedkarite, Nehruvian, Coolie, all as being attempts at trying to capture a type of person, which is also interesting because an attempt of this kind need not feel obliged immediately to pass the matrix of identities necessarily. I mean, you're trying to formally isolate attributes of a kind of person, and I thought there was an extraordinary ambition there. And this I saw panning out in many, many, many entries. It's as if someone who's setting out to study Indian society is being asked to look at these places also outside of the big institutional focuses or the big sort of meta pan-India words. In a way, it is the project didn't even seem like a linguistic conceptual one as much as something that's asking you to look more carefully at how living practices unfold. I just thought I should put this out there. And
thank you, both to Vrinda and you. I mean, I I'm not sure. I mean, this is actually just an elaboration, not a response. First of all, I think Vrinda summed up the one aspect of the project very well. So I must begin by saying that Rukmini and I did not have a conception of the project which very clearly sort of overlapped with each other. It was complementary. I mean, she looked at it in terms of linguistics and philosophy. My motivation was more political. So many of the ways in which one debates the choice of words or the use of a keyword may have been clearer with her than it was with me. I must admit. So many of the things that Vrinda opened up were fascinating for me, and it's an area in which I'm not very familiar. My motivation, as I said, was political, and political in an epistemic way. I mean, I felt, I always felt why does a scholar in India have to use terms like modus vivendi? Why do we have to be able to say anything significant, borrow, the German Weltanschauung, or why is that a sign of arrival? And I felt this placed a huge burden on a whole generation of humanities and social science scholars in India, who had to enter the metropolitan language. So my participation in the project, and it was conceptualized by Rukmini. I sort of added and expanded it, was to bring in all these fun words which I found every day in discussions outside the seminar room, at chai shops, in bus stops, on institutional lawns, etc., which in a sense conveyed the richness of India, but did not enter the seminar room. So my motivation was in that sense political, to bring them in, to give them that respectability, in a sense to combat what people like Ames Césaire and Frantz Fanon talk about, to combat an inferiorization that colonialism has produced. And that inferiorization has entered and crept into language. And unless we feel confident in the use of concepts which come from what Anantamurthy calls he referred to English as a sort of regional language. Concepts that come from the various bhasas of India, we would not be able to have a rich conversation as the project requires, as representing India requires. So my exercise and my motivation was to be inclusive, to be accommodative, to bring people in. So therefore, words like but as you rightly said, once we include the word, it comes with a whole baggage of meanings which we now need to spell out. So, for example, the word juggi jhopadi, tells you so much about the politics of urban space, about the livelihood of subalterns, about services being made available, about precarity, about economic activity. There's a whole world opens up, and we've got that in our lexicon. Or take, for example, Nara. Suddenly the whole history of Indian politics becomes available to you. From Garibi Hotao to today, sab ke saath sabka vikas. So suddenly Nara, and you can actually plot it chronologically, how Naras keep changing. During the emergency, there was one set of Naras. Today, there's another set of Naras, which is, even in Bengal today, the BJP has used the Nara of 30% ka government, immediately to sort of convey that this is a government that's appeasing the minorities. So there is a whole language which we've now tried to bring into the volume. I think the one final point is that we did not have a very rigorous methodology which we gave the contributors. We didn't tell the contributors, this is the method you must follow. We gave them a kind of template, but we allowed each one to inhabit that template with their own imagination. So what you will see in this book is a plurality of politics, of political understandings, and a plurality of cultural representation. The authors were encouraged to inhabit the words in the ways that they thought was relevant and significant. So the book, in that sense, is the beginning. It's not a comprehensive exercise. It's the beginning of what we hope will grow into many projects. In fact, Rukmini has been arguing for taking it online, so that it's a living lexicon. It's not just a sort of complete lexicon which has been published and put on a library shelf, but it's a living. People can keep adding words to it once it goes through adequate debate. And finally, when we prepared our final list, it wasn't just Rukmini and I, which we did, meet several times over several years, honing down a list from 500, 600 words, 200, finding contributors. But we also did this consultatively. We held workshops and seminars at the Shimla Institute, at CSTS. So the list that finally, the list of words that finally went into the volume went through a production process which was consultative, which was inclusive, and which involved several conversations with a lot of people. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. We have just half an hour left, and I think it's a time that we give the audience a chance to ask us their questions.
Lakshmi Krishnamurthy asks, do borrowed words mean the same thing in two languages involved? Usually not, question mark.
So, this is a very important question, which is, when you borrow a word, does it have the same meaning? And you can say that even when you use a word which is not borrowed, it doesn't have two meanings. It doesn't have just one single meaning, because it's not a package in a situation which is a dialogue. Words always have multiple meanings, because the people who are using these words are not tabula rasas. They bring with them their whole culture, their background, and so on. When it comes to borrowed words, that is a lot of the time when we were thinking about words like tension and making all these lists, I found that, borrowing is a process which continues in language. It is part of the history of language. So people didn't think that tension was a borrowed word. They thought it was their word. And we are not told the sources and etymologies of where words come from. As children, when we learn language, we learn it all together. So the notion of borrowing is a pretty scholarly notion. Does it have the same meaning? Very probably not. As Peter said, with setting or any of these words, or adjust, they have been humne apna liya. We have made it our own. And the way we make it our own goes back to the point which Brinda pointed out. We use it. Words do things. So tension occupies a space in modernity which is very important. But even without that theoretical intervention, people adopted it, used it, did not think of it as a foreign word. Does it have the same meaning that it would have in a parent culture like England or wherever it originated? Probably not. Indians do not use the word tense. They use the word tension. They use it as tension mat lena. Do not take tension. And do not take tension is a kind of verbal collocation which you will not get in the West. So words change according to context, according to their usage, what you do with them, and they have different meanings. For example, if you use the word Atma, it has very little, it has thin meaning for all of us. What the contributors to this volume did, and we trusted them, is that they gave it body, they gave it heft. And from that point, you could take off and say, I agree with this, I don't agree with this. One of the problems with our keywords book is that it is in English, and it's a fairly complicated English. So already when this book is, let's say, translated into other languages, one of the things we'll find is that meanings will shift. So this question of borrowing is really critical in language, but I would say in a single word answer, yes, single sentence answer, yes, it does change meaning, but that is part of being part of a living in exchange. Words are not adopted ऐसे ही, they are adopted because the culture really has a thirst and a need, an epistemic hunger for them. They change meaning, that should not bother us. They retain their original meaning, that should not bother us all that much. Children mostly do not know when they learn a language whether a word is borrowed or not. So I would say maybe this should be a secondary concern, but it's still an important one.
Angela Xavier asks, was Conceptual History of Reinhard Koselleck a complementary source of inspiration for the book? Namely, his idea that certain words, the emergence of certain words, indicate structural changes in society, and which new keywords may indicate these changes in the Indian case, and when?
Should I? Yeah.
Peter, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Angela, for that question. I was just going through the book because I must confess that, every time I open the book, I still discover new words which I had not fully appreciated, which you'd included. So it's always a fun thing opening up the book. And I did that in response to your question, which keywords in contemporary India would express the structural change today. And I'm sorry to say that the one word that I was looking for is not there. Or maybe I missed it. It's Hindutva. Hindutva is a word which should have found presence in the book. It certainly describes the politics of contemporary India. Another word which I think describes the structural change that's taking place in India at the moment is appeasement. That's also a word which seems to be missing. So there are words like that. I mean, many of the words that are in the book do talk of the economic period of neoliberal thinking, which describes the structural change in India. For example, we have an entry called LPG, liberalization, privatization, and liberalization. So basically, talking about the three thrusts of the neoliberal project. So there are words which talk about the neoliberal project, but about the political project, I think there are new words that we can introduce, when we take this project forward.
Yeah, what I was wondering is that whether you all want to make the shift from looking at individual words to looking at clusters. So in terms of the question, what particular words indicate or could indicate a structural change in contemporary India? One way of answering that question is to move away from any particular word or the search for particular words and look at the constellation. So even though one particular word may be missing, but when working together holistically, one can import those kinds of the thrust for structural change. And that's what I thought was part of the power of your project, where you are talking of individual words, Certainly, you're listing the individual words, but the individual words work together to create a space, to create a structural space, and infiltrate in your language that cultural space.
I just want to add a small footnote, which has to do with this very question of clusters and relationships, because a word, and the poster that Chandan created was very much like that. It had the book, and then it had all sorts of spikes coming in.
It's a BIC designer.
Accepting your designer. But I was thinking how interesting this is, because these words are seen as coming out of the book, whereas in fact, they came into the book via the processes of listening that you're talking about. So that was a representative perspective, which was very interesting to me, and relates to this point of how words cluster and how all those spikes coming out would make sense to an Indian, although in different structural units. And I think that in response to Peter said, look, an important word that is missing is the word Hindutva. But there is Hindu Rashtra. And Hindu Rashtra, the entry for Hindu Rashtra relates to the concept of Hindutva, and also an entry on Hinduism by Shashi Tharoor. And so if you think in terms of conceptual clusters and subtle differences, they may not be Hindutva, but there was Hindu Rashtra, and there was Hinduism, and then these words reused the words Hindu and Hindutva in many of the essays. So those, I would say, are already conceptual connections, but the reader has to be also not just a listener, but an explorer, a discoverer, and often hack through the jungle and create her own pathways. And so we have done some hacking. So I've always said, before you have groundbreaking work, you must have, you must have pathfinding. And we have done some amount of pathfinding, conceptualizing architectural structure. Now, the other important point I should mention is that from a linguistic point of view, you always think of language in terms of the temporal axis, diachrony, and synchrony. So synchrony is what we have now. We have these words at a particular stage in time. If we have this dictionary last for 20 years, we will see these structural changes to be theorized very clearly. So I think that one of the things which words teach us is to be patient and to have hope, again, an affective word, while hacking through this jungle. We've done some hacking, some ground clearing, but we still need to get to the groundbreaking stuff. And I think this is actually groundbreaking, not because of us, but because of all the contributors and the immediate insights they brought to the volume, that they didn't fight with why should you have baatcheet and in this vocabulary, because a lot of these words I thought of and would like to write on my own, like tension and so on, and have written about. But it made me, this exercise made me personally very receptive and in a way unselfish. I knew I couldn't grab all these words and write. There were many better people to write about them, to create the clusteral connections. And so somebody else, Ramakant, who's a wonderful linguist, wrote about baatcheet, which was a word I wanted to write about but didn't. So in some ways, it is to give up on the individuality and come back to the story of the collective and what we consider our nodal structural points. And many of these words will go, but a substantial number of them will last if we wait 10 years to see how the ground has shifted. Because this is from first principles. So I would say structure, we have to look. There is some structure here, but not the kind of structure which you can rely on, because, and also we are writing at a time of tremendous cultural change and shift, which is why I thought of this volume in the first place. So it's those are some considerations.
Rukmini, I think you're being a little modest in underplaying the editor's role, because I can imagine the very same contributors writing about the very same entries very differently outside of this book. So the template that you said you offered them has made a difference. If you want to use the metaphor of loosening up, I think people have loosened up a little bit in writing for this book, and that's been good things. There are other questions.
This question is from Pratiti Balal, and she will ask it herself.
Your project seems to epitomize interdisciplinarity, etymology, ethnography, linguistics, cognition, politics, history, the list can go on. So it seems to me if Raymond Williams' elegant entries were like solos, this collaborative project feels more like a polyphonic experimental orchestra with not always harmonious or predictable results, perhaps. So I'd just like to ask for your reflections and any lessons you learned about it in interdisciplinarity. And I have a sort of another question related. There have been other collaborative keywords projects, such as Colin McCabe's Keyword for Today, and the one at the University of Pittsburgh, which I believe is an ongoing one. So did you also follow these other projects that were the next generation after Raymond Williams?
Peter, do you want to go? Can I? Whenever. So the first point, the second point you made about did we follow these other projects? They are in fact listed meticulously in the book, including the differences between our project and these. I can't comment on ongoing projects, but we certainly looked at the McCabe and various other very important keywords projects, and then thought of, for example, including these material culture words, which I did not find in the other projects, acronyms and so on. So in some ways, and the situatedness of this was different. The other point you made was about, sorry, can you repeat interdisciplinarity? Yes, it is a very interdisciplinary project, and partly that is to do with the times. You immediately realize when you read, and when I first went to Cambridge, just to deviate, I met Raymond Williams, and he was a typical, at that time very old, and typical Cambridge at dawn, doing his work in isolation, interacting with a few graduate students, thinking on his own, writing on his own. In our times, if any one of us, Brinda or Peter or you or me or Chandan, had wanted to write these entries all by themselves, sitting in a college, the time would have passed them by. It is not only that it is interdisciplinary, but it has to be interdisciplinary. It has to involve politicians, economics, and so on. This is the compulsion of the shifting age we live in, with almost all projects across the sciences and the arts involving building or rebuilding the idea of a collective. What is a collective today? And that collective may not be the same collective that we had, in Raymond. The individual was crucial to Raymond Williams' project. So, but the individual cannot be crucial to the kind of cultural project which we have in India, which, as I said, is the size of Western Europe and quite diverse. So, interdisciplinarity was the last thing I want to say about interdisciplinarity is, to my mind, what interdisciplinarity means is when you ask questions that you cannot answer within your own discipline, say linguistics or whatever it is. And then I go to Peter and say, can you help me? This is not a question I can answer from within my own discipline. It concerns issues political issues, philosophical issues, which are not tackled in my discipline. So those questions at the edges of the discipline drive interdisciplinarity, and there are more and more of that today. So this book is the product of its times. It is a product of necessary collaborations, and it is a project which asks questions outside the comfort zone of our own so-called disciplines. And those are the important reasons for building it collaboratively. That's what I would say first off.
I'll just add a very brief comment. For me, the interdisciplinarity has come after the project is complete. I don't think we approach the project with great clarity that we want to be deliberately interdisciplinary. As I said, the first exercise was to recognize that we wanted to go, outside the highbrow concepts and bring in a whole lot of other concepts from everyday speech, from everyday conversations in multiple settings. If those concepts that we brought into the seminar room produced an interdisciplinarity, then that was wonderful, and I think it did. But that was not the intention. Yes, we did give a template. The seven sort of clusters that we had identified themselves represent that interdisciplinarity. But I, for one, was not very clear and was deliberately not intending to sort of first sort out our goals in terms of issues like interdisciplinarity and then begin with the project. The exercise of inclusion was partly motivated by bringing in fun words and partly motivated by the politics of challenging the stuffiness of the seminar room.
Yeah. So.
Should we do the other?
So, Brinda, would you? There's one more question, or would Brinda?
There are 3 more questions, and I think we have 3 minutes. So let's try and
take the question.
I'll just read out 2 questions and 1 comment, actually. Simon Verghese asks, while researching for the book, was it difficult to work on recently added words in English, if they were considered? Colasso asks, does a keyword from the past, like Garibi or Hatao, find equivalence in modern India and an entry into the book? Similarly, the now defunct Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai has any modern keyword for the absolutely relevant question of the relationship with the neighbor. Akanksha Sharma makes an observation about Samosapedia that was quite popular online starting about a decade ago. It was crowdsourcing South Asian meanings for words and particular phrases. It was more tongue-in-cheek than scholarly, but shows popular acknowledgement for the contextual meanings we've given to many words.
Just briefly, I think Garibi Hatao finds mention in our entry on Naras. Each of these Naras did not get full elaboration, but the entry, because it was a short entry, in a sense conveys the changing Naras that were part of political speech at certain periods of India's post-colonial history. Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai I don't think is there, but certainly Garibi Hatao is there. Today there's a whole new sort of set of Naras that has entered our political vocabulary. As I've said, things like Sabke Saath, Sabka Vikas, Achhe Din, so on. But this is an ongoing exercise. Yeah.
We'll have
Linda?
last comments.
Should we? Okay, I thought that, yes, I mean, I agree with, and I think what you all are trying to do came out clearly for me. And I thought one of the important things and distinctive things was that you were using words to capture lived space. And given the theories of intersectionality, it becomes necessary to bring in all kinds of disciplines because life and even an individual is not monochromatic. And at one point, I think Rukmini talked about the temporal and the diachronic histories which invade our present and also therefore in a sense affect the future. So once again, I keep going back to my gut feeling that the past and words from the past are always there reverberating in the background. Because our words in the present are working in this temporal, space. So even if the particular word from the past is not there, it's there in the background always.
One quick comment about what else the book does. I think it's for anyone starting out to think about the country, one has been thinking about India. I mean, the diversity of places where you could be looking to think about something. The variety of archives that we get a glimpse of through the course of the entries is truly, very, very, very refreshing. You actually come out energized that, okay, I could be thinking about that source as well. So, in addition to, how to look, the where to look part also has been, beautifully sort of addressed in the book. Unless there's anything else the editors wish to add or Vrinda wants to add, I think we should bring the session to a close. It's 8 o'clock.
I just want to say that among the many disagreements that Rukmini and I had, one word that didn't find entry in the book is Uparwala. So I'm sorry about that.
Uparwala. There are many, my favorites that didn't get in. Chalan, for example, is not in. And I think it's such an important word. Nor is the Constitution. So, and this is, Bhuk is not there. So this is because contributors did not contribute in time, etc., and so on. So this is an ongoing exercise. With regard to this Nara question, I would like to say that we tried our best to stick to one word, possibly have two words, and later maybe we can move on to clusters and slogans and other cultural memories. But these are points of entry, they're points of departure. So that's very important to remember that we are not. And I want to end with one anecdote of the way in which I trace this going back to Poila Boishakh and Durga. Every year or every few years, I ask my students, Durga has these 10 arms. And she has Shankha, Chakra, Gada, and lotus and so on in her hands, but she has 4 hands free. What would you put in that? And my students at the IIT said, when I first began teaching, which was 25, 30 years ago, oh, atom bomb, no question. Then they moved to blender and mixing. And now they say computer and mobile and cell phone. And in this sort of way, this is another, fun way, to use Peter's vocabulary, to track the ways in which people are changing the vocabulary technologically, because my students are from the IIT, but changing the vocabulary. And so now today, almost nobody says atom bomb. And the question there is, are we moving then to a less violent society? And I think there's a big question mark there. But there is, so these questions and these experiments, these thought experiments, this book is a thought experiment, makes us think about these big questions about violence, the Yudhisthira questions. And so I think that it's made us all think, and for that, I'm grateful to our audience today, to Chandan, to all our contributors. And I just want to say thank you. And we miss Shiv.
Yes. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Rukmini. Thank you, Vrinda, and the audience. The book, I have a little entry in the book, but that doesn't make my comment a partisan one. it's truly a book that is, furthers the task of seeking intellectual freedom in thinking about this hugely complex thing called India. And I would applaud the authors for their efforts. And thank you all for being with us. Thank you, Vrunda, again for being on the panel. See you all.
Thanks to the
Thank
Bangalore.
Thanks to Bangalore BIC. Yes.
Thank you for giving us the opportunity.